My parents believed my sister's lie and cut me off. 5 years later, her life was in my hands. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Kaylin Voss, and my life changed because my sister said something that was not true. One moment I had a family, and the next moment I had nothing. Nobody asked me for my side. Nobody gave me a chance to explain. They just accepted her words like they were facts. I still remember that day clearly. My parents looked at me differently, like I had become a stranger. My sister stood behind them, calm and quiet, while I tried to understand what was happening. Every sentence I said made things worse. The more I spoke, the less they believed me. Soon after that, I was told to leave. There was no argument left, no discussion, just a decision already made. I packed a small bag in silence because I knew nothing I said would change their minds. Walking out of that house felt like stepping into a world where I didn't belong anymore. After that, life was not easy. I had no support, no safety net, just myself. I worked wherever I could, took jobs that barely paid, and slowly learned how to survive alone. It was painful, but it also made me stronger in ways I never expected. Years passed without contact. I stopped waiting for an apology because I realized it might never come. I built a new life, piece by piece, until I finally stood on my own without needing anyone's approval. What I didn't know then was that the same family who pushed me away would one day come back into my life in a way I could never have imagined. Maris Voss was always seen as the perfect one in my family. Everyone trusted her without question. She knew how to speak in a way that made people feel comfortable, like she could never do anything wrong. My parents often looked at her with pride, as if she was everything they ever wanted in a daughter. I was never like that. I didn't know how to pretend or say things just to make people happy. If something felt wrong, I would say it. If I disagreed, I showed it. That made me difficult in their eyes. Over time, I noticed how easily they listened to her and how quickly they dismissed me. Maris never had to fight for attention. It always came naturally to her. Even when she made small mistakes, they were brushed off or explained away. But for me, even small things became big issues. I always felt like I had to prove I was telling the truth, even when I had no reason to lie. At family gatherings, she would sit quietly and smile, while I often ended up in debates or trying to defend myself. It wasn't that I wanted conflict. I just couldn't accept things that didn't make sense. That difference slowly built a wall between how they saw her and how they saw me. Looking back, I realize I was never really part of their idea of the ideal daughter. Maris fit that picture perfectly, and I didn't. That gap grew over the years without anyone trying to close it. It was already there long before anything serious happened between us. What hurt most wasn't just the favoritism. It was knowing that no matter what I did, I could never be seen the same way she was. Everything changed because of one accusation that didn't take much effort to say. Maris told my parents I had taken money from her savings without permission. It was said so calmly, so confidently, that it sounded true to them right away. I remember my shock more than anything else. I asked her why she would say that, but she didn't answer directly. She just looked upset, like she was the one being wronged. That reaction made everything worse for me. My parents didn't ask questions. They didn't check anything. They already decided who they believed. I tried to explain that I had nothing to do with it. I told them there must be some mistake, that we should look at the accounts properly. But my voice didn't carry weight in that room. Every sentence I spoke seemed to push them further away from me instead of closer to the truth. My mother avoided my eyes. My father spoke in a cold tone, saying they were disappointed. That word stayed with me more than anything else. It felt final, like a judgment that couldn't be changed no matter what I said after that. Maris stayed quiet most of the time, only speaking when needed. That silence made her seem more believable, not less. I realized in that moment that I wasn't being questioned because they wanted answers. I was being judged because they had already chosen a side. After that conversation, nothing felt normal anymore. Even the air in the house felt different. I could sense that I had already lost something important, even before any real decision was officially made. I didn't give up right away. I kept trying to make them see reason. I showed them my bank records, my messages, anything that could prove I didn't take anything from Maris. I even suggested we sit down with someone neutral to go through everything carefully. But no one wanted to look deeper. My words started to feel useless in that room. Every time I spoke, I could feel their patience fading. My father raised his hand once, not in anger, but to stop me from talking further. That moment hit harder than anything else. It was like my voice didn't matter anymore. My mother looked torn, but not in a way that helped me. She kept saying how painful it was for her, how she couldn't believe one of her daughters would do something like this. It felt like she was already grieving a version of me she had decided was real, even though it wasn't. I remember standing there, holding my phone with all the proof I had gathered, but nobody asked to see it properly. It was like the truth didn't matter once the story had already been accepted. Maris didn't argue much. She didn't need to. Everything was already leaning in her direction. I tried one last time to ask them to think clearly, to not rush into something so serious. That was when my father finally told me to stop talking. His voice was firm, final, like the conversation had ended for him long before I realized it. After that, I felt something inside me break quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow acceptance that no matter what I said next, it would not change their decision about me. Within a few days, everything was decided without me being part of it. I was told I no longer belonged there and needed to leave. It wasn't a conversation. It was a statement. There was no space for questions, no chance to argue further. The house that once felt familiar suddenly felt distant, like I was only visiting a place that no longer recognized me. Nobody tried to stop me from packing. Nobody asked how I felt. The silence around me said more than words ever could. I went into my room and started putting things together. It wasn't much because I didn't feel like I had time or energy to think properly. Every item I placed in that bag felt heavier than it should have. I kept expecting someone to walk in and say this was all a mistake, but that moment never came. Downstairs, life continued in a strange way. Normal sounds, normal movement, but nothing felt normal for me anymore. It was like I had already been erased from the space even before I physically left it. When I finally came down with my bag, no one spoke much. There were no emotional goodbyes, no attempt to hold me back. I stood there for a moment, hoping someone might change their mind at the last second. Instead, I was met with distance and quiet disappointment. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. That simple action felt like the end of something permanent. The street looked the same, but everything in my life had shifted completely. I didn't know where I was going at that moment. I only knew I couldn't stay. I kept walking forward, carrying everything I had left, even though it felt like most of my life had already been left behind. Starting over was not something I planned, it was something I had to do. I went to a different city where no one knew me, where my name didn't carry any history or judgment. At first, everything felt unfamiliar, from the streets to the way people spoke to each other. I took whatever work I could find. Some days I cleaned offices early in the morning, other days I worked in small shops or helped in storage places. The pay was low, and the hours were long, but it gave me a way to keep going. I learned quickly that survival meant accepting work I would have ignored before. Living alone also changed me. I had to manage everything on my own: rent, food, and basic needs. There was no one to fall back on if things went wrong. That pressure forced me to become more careful and focused with every decision I made. Slowly, I stopped waiting for things to go back to how they were. At first, I used to check my phone often, hoping for a message or call that never came. Over time, I stopped expecting anything from that part of my life. The silence became normal. I started building a routine. Work, rest, repeat. It wasn't exciting, but it gave structure to my days. I also began learning new skills whenever I had free time, trying to improve my chances for better opportunities in the future. People around me came and went, but I stayed distant. I didn't want attachments that could break easily again. My focus was simple: stay stable, stay independent, and never depend on anyone the way I did before. Life didn't become easy, but it became mine again in a way I could control. 5 years passed without me looking back. Life didn't slow down, it just kept moving, and I learned to move with it instead of fighting it. I stopped being the version of myself that kept waiting for things to fix themselves. Instead, I focused on becoming someone who could handle whatever came next. I rebuilt my identity step by step. I went back to using my name fully, Kaylin Voss, not as a reminder of the past, but as proof that I had survived it. Work became the center of my life, and I pushed myself into areas that once felt too complex or out of reach. That's how I entered financial consulting. At first, it was just numbers and reports, but over time I started seeing patterns others missed. I learned how money flows through systems, how people shift it quietly, and how easily truth can be buried inside paperwork. I worked long hours, studied cases late into the night, and kept improving without needing anyone's approval. There was no one to impress anymore, only myself. That made me sharper, more focused, and harder to distract. Over time, I became known for finding things others overlooked. Small details in accounts, hidden links between transactions, and changes that didn't match the story being told. It wasn't about guessing, it was about understanding how people think when they try to hide something. I also learned to keep my distance from personal connections at work. Trust didn't come easily anymore, so I let results speak instead of emotions. It helped me stay clear and professional in every situation. By the time those 5 years ended, I wasn't the same person who left everything behind. I had rebuilt myself into someone steady, observant, and prepared for anything that came my way. It started like any normal assignment. My company handed me a large business portfolio that needed urgent review. The client was private, which wasn't unusual in my field. Companies fail for many reasons, and my job was to figure out where things went wrong and what could be saved. I went through the documents carefully, line by line, expecting nothing more than financial problems and poor decisions. At first, everything looked standard: losses, missed payments, and restructuring attempts that didn't work out. But then I saw the ownership details. I stopped for a moment, thinking I had read it wrong. The name connected to the file was one I hadn't seen in years. It didn't feel real at first. I read it again, slower this time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The more I checked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a coincidence. The business was tied to people from my past, and not just in a small way. The connections were direct, involving decisions that had clearly gone wrong over time. I continued reviewing the rest of the file, but my focus shifted completely. Numbers and charts no longer felt like just data. They were starting to form a picture I never expected to see again. I didn't react outwardly. I kept my expression steady and finished the initial review like normal. But inside, I knew something had just changed. For the first time in years, my past wasn't something far behind me. It was sitting right in front of me, inside a folder I was responsible for analyzing. And what made it worse was the fact that I had been chosen for this specific task without knowing why. As I went deeper into the files, the full picture of Maris's situation became clearer. Her life after marriage hadn't gone the way she'd probably expected. The business she was connected to was falling apart piece by piece, and most of it traced back to poor financial choices made over time. Her husband had trusted her with decisions, thinking things would improve, but instead the losses kept growing. There were loans taken under pressure, investments that never paid off, and agreements that left the company exposed. It wasn't one single mistake. It was a pattern that slowly pulled everything down. What stood out most to me was how carefully everything had been hidden at first. On paper, it didn't look like complete failure. But when I followed the flow of money and reviewed internal records, the reality was much worse than what was being shown publicly. There were signs of desperation too. Late attempts to cover gaps, shifting funds between accounts, and short-term fixes that only delayed the problem. Each move seemed to make the situation more unstable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same person who once accused me without proof was now at the center of a situation built on real financial damage. But this time, there was no misunderstanding involved. The evidence was already there in front of me, written in numbers and reports. I didn't rush to any judgment. I kept going through everything carefully, making sure I understood the full scope before drawing conclusions. My role required clarity, not emotion. Still, it was hard not to notice how closely her current life was tied to the very kind of chaos she once caused in mine. The more I worked through the documents, the clearer the situation became. What looked like a failing business was actually a chain reaction of choices that had built up over time. Her husband was now facing pressure from banks, partners, and legal notices, all connected to financial decisions made inside the company. Many of those decisions had Maris's involvement behind them. Her name appeared in approvals, agreements, and internal communications that showed she had more control than anyone outside the business realized. Some of the risks taken were extreme, and when they didn't work out, everything started collapsing at once. There were also records of accounts that were not properly declared. Money had been moved in ways that raised serious questions, and now investigators were beginning to look closely at every transaction. The situation was no longer just about debt. It had turned into a legal and financial mess that kept growing. Then came the assignment that changed everything for me personally. I was officially brought in to restructure what was left of the company. My job was to stabilize the finances, cut losses, and prepare a recovery plan. I had done similar work before, but this time the case was different. Because the people involved were not strangers. I knew exactly who I was dealing with, even if they didn't know it yet. My name had changed in their world, just like their lives had changed in mine. I stayed professional and accepted the assignment without showing any reaction. On the outside, it was just another complex case. On the inside, it felt like the past had quietly walked back into my present, asking me to handle its consequences. The meeting was set in a quiet conference room. Everything felt formal, controlled, and professional. I walked in first, already seated when the rest of the team arrived. My role was clear to everyone there, even if they didn't know the full background behind it. Maris came in a few minutes later with her husband. She looked tired, stressed in a way that couldn't be hidden by appearance alone. She didn't look at me closely at first. To her, I was just another consultant reviewing their situation. We went through the usual process: reports, explanations, financial summaries. I listened, asked questions, and kept my tone steady. Nothing about my behavior gave anything away. I made sure of that. At one point, I asked a question that required her input directly. That's when she finally looked at me properly. There was a pause, a small shift in her expression, like something in her memory was trying to place me. It took a few seconds before recognition hit. I saw it happen in real time. Her posture changed, her voice slightly hesitated, and her confidence slipped. She tried to continue speaking normally, but it wasn't the same anymore. Her husband noticed the change too, but didn't understand it. The room stayed professional, but the energy between us shifted in a way only I could fully feel. I didn't react to her recognition. I stayed focused on the discussion and continued my role as if nothing had changed. That was important. But inside, I knew the distance between our past and present had just collapsed into one moment. She was no longer dealing with a stranger in front of her. And for the first time in years, she realized that too. After the meeting, I had access to everything connected to the case. Reports kept coming in, updates kept stacking, and every detail added more weight to the situation they were already struggling with. It wasn't just one problem anymore. It was a network of issues that all needed decisions to move forward. I reviewed options carefully. Some parts of the business could be saved, but only if major changes were made quickly. Other parts were beyond repair and would have to be shut down to stop further losses. Every choice had consequences, and none of them were small. What made it more complicated was the urgency. Creditors were waiting, contracts were expiring, and legal pressure was increasing each day. Time wasn't on their side, and delays were making everything worse. Maris and her husband had no idea how much control the situation had shifted into my hands. They thought they were dealing with a standard restructuring process, but the decisions now depended heavily on my reports and recommendations. What I wrote would directly influence what survived and what didn't. I stayed objective through it all. I focused on facts, numbers, and outcomes rather than emotions. That was the only way to handle something this sensitive without making mistakes. Still, there was a strange weight to it. Years ago, I was the one pushed out and ignored. Now, I was the one reviewing whether the world they built would continue to exist in its current form. Every document I signed off on carried real consequences. Jobs, contracts, and reputations were all tied to the conclusions I made. And without needing to say anything out loud, the roles had completely shifted. The outcome of their situation now depended on decisions I was responsible for making.